Rome, the mightiest empire the ancient world had ever seen. Two legendary generals, once brothers in arms, now bitter rivals. Pompey the Great, the undefeated conqueror of the East. Julius Caesar, the brilliant strategist who defied the gods themselves. Together, they had ruled Rome as allies, but power corrupts and ambition divides. This wasn't just a war of legions and swords. It was a battle for the very soul of Rome. A republic, built over centuries, now trembled on the edge of destruction. How did these two titans go from sharing feasts to plotting each other's demise? What drove Caesar to cross that fateful river, the Rubicon, knowing it would ignite a fire that could consume them all? And here's the real question. Could Rome, the city that had survived barbarian hordes and civil strife for 500 years, survive the greed of its own greatest men? Or was its fate already sealed the moment Caesar and Pompey locked eyes in hatred? Stick with us, because this is a story of loyalty shattered, of betrayal so deep it echoes through history, a tale where one man's gamble changed the course of civilization forever. And trust me, by the end, you'll see why this war didn't just end lives, it ended an era. Oh, and before we dive in, make sure you hit that like button if you love epic history, share this with fellow Rome fanatics, and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more tales of power, glory, and downfall. Because trust me, the next story, even wilder. Fun fact, did you know Pompey and Caesar were actually family? Yep, Caesar's daughter Julia was married to Pompey. Her death shattered their alliance, and Rome paid the price. History's greatest tragedies often start at home. Imagine Rome at its most powerful, but also at its most fragile. Three men held the world in their hands: Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. They called it the First Triumvirate. Not an official title, but a whispered deal between giants. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, bankrolled it. Pompey, the legendary general, lent his prestige. And Caesar? He was the wild card, the rising star with a hunger for glory. Together they were unstoppable, until they weren't. The cracks started with Crassus. Picture this. The year 53 before Christ. Crassus, desperate for military fame to match his wealth, marches into Parthia, modern-day Iraq, with 40,000 legionaries. Arrogance blinded him. The Parthians, masters of horse archery, lured him into the desert. The result? A slaughter. Crassus's head was used as a prop in a play. Rome was stunned. Now, with Crassus gone, the balance of power tilted dangerously. Pompey, once content to rule from the shadows, grew paranoid. Caesar, meanwhile, was conquering Gaul, winning battles, gaining loyal soldiers, and writing letters that made him a hero to the people. The Senate? They feared him. So they turned to Pompey, flattering him, whispering, "You're the true defender of Rome." But here's the twist. Caesar wasn't just a general, he was a political genius. He knew Pompey's weakness, pride, so he offered a peace deal. "Let me keep my command, and we'll share power." Pompey hesitated. The Senate, led by the scheming Cato, pushed harder. Caesar must surrender his army or be declared an enemy. The stage was set. No more backroom deals, no more alliances. Just two men, their egos, and a republic caught in the crossfire. And the terrifying part? Neither realized yet. This wouldn't just be a war for Rome. It would be the war that ended Rome as they knew it. Fun fact, Caesar's Gallic Wars, his own propaganda, was a bestseller in Rome. Pompey never wrote a memoir. In the battle for public opinion, Caesar was already winning before the first sword was drawn. Picture this. January of the year 49 before Christ. A cold wind blows along the banks of the Rubicon River, a tiny stream barely worth a footnote on a map. But this river isn't just water. It's a line drawn in the sand by Rome itself. Cross it with an army, and you commit treason. Cross it as Julius Caesar did, and you change history forever. Caesar stood there, staring at the shallow waters, his 13th legion behind him, breath visible in the winter air. The Senate had sent him an ultimatum. Disband your army, return to Rome as a private citizen, or be declared an enemy of the state, a death sentence in all but name. But Caesar wasn't a man who bowed to threats. He turned to his officers, his voice steady, and uttered 3 words that would echo through time. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. With that, he spurred his horse forward, and Rome's fate was sealed. Now here's the wild part. Caesar didn't just happen to be near the Rubicon. This was a calculated gamble. He'd spent years in Gaul, winning battles, amassing wealth, and forging an army loyal to him, not to the Senate. And Pompey, the man who'd once been his ally, even his son-in-law, he was now in Rome, whispering to the senators, convincing them Caesar had to be stopped. But here's what Pompey didn't expect: speed. While the Senate dithered, thinking Caesar would hesitate, he moved like lightning. In weeks, towns across Italy surrendered without a fight. Why? Because Caesar wasn't just a general. He was a legend. His men would follow him into hell and the people. Many saw him as a hero, a reformer, while the Senate seemed like out-of-touch elites. And Pompey? He panicked. Instead of fighting, he fled to Greece, abandoning Rome, thinking he could regroup. But that was his fatal mistake. By running, he handed Caesar the ultimate propaganda victory. Look how weak they are. So remember this moment, the Rubicon. Not just a river, but the point where Caesar chose war over surrender, where one man's ambition collided with a republic's laws and shattered them forever. And the craziest part? The Rubicon was so insignificant, we don't even know exactly where it was. Lost to time, like the Republic itself. What would you have done in Caesar's place? Would you cross the Rubicon or back down? Let's debate in the comments. On paper, Pompey should have won this war. Think about it. He had everything. The full backing of the Senate, the richest provinces fueling his war chest, the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean, and most importantly, time. He could afford to wait, to starve Caesar out, to let politics do the work for him. But war isn't fought on paper. While Pompey sat in Greece, gathering his forces, playing the long game, Caesar moved. Like a storm sweeping across Italy, he took city after city, not just by force, but by sheer audacity. Towns opened their gates to him. Veterans who had served under him years before flocked to his banner. Because Caesar understood something Pompey didn't. In civil war, speed is everything. Then came Dyrrhachium. Pompey finally had Caesar right where he wanted him, trapped, outnumbered, his supply lines stretched thin. For once, the great gambler was on the back foot. Pompey's forces pressed in, and Caesar's men began to buckle. Victory was within Pompey's grasp. But that's when Caesar did the unthinkable. Instead of fighting to the last man, he retreated. Not in panic, but with purpose. Because Caesar knew Pompey's weakness, he was cautious, too cautious. And so, what looked like defeat was actually the setup for the greatest trap in Roman history. While Pompey hesitated, Caesar slipped away, regrouped, rearmed, and turned the tables. Now, the final act loomed. A dusty plain in Thessaly, a place called Pharsalus. And here's the brutal truth. By then, Pompey's advantage was already slipping. His senators were bickering, his allies were doubting him. And Caesar? He had nothing left to lose. Funny, isn't it? Pompey had every resource, every advantage. But in the end, it was the man who acted who decided Rome's fate. What could have saved the triumvirate? Was it Crassus's death that doomed them? Or was the alliance always destined to collapse? Drop your thoughts below. And if you're loving this story so far, hit that like button and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more tales of history's greatest showdowns. Picture this: 2 massive armies facing each other across the plains of Pharsalus in Greece, 48 years before Christ. The morning mist slowly lifts, revealing what would become one of history's most decisive battles. On one side stands Pompey the Great with nearly 50,000 seasoned troops, the backing of the Roman Senate, and every advantage a general could ask for. On the other side, Julius Caesar with barely 25,000 battle-weary soldiers, outnumbered 2-1, but carrying something far more dangerous than superior numbers: absolute desperation and unwavering loyalty to their commander. Caesar knew he was walking into what looked like certain death. His men had been marching and fighting for months, following him across rivers and mountains, trusting in his genius, even when logic screamed they should surrender. But here's where Caesar's tactical brilliance truly shines through the pages of history. As both armies lined up for battle, Pompey made what seemed like the obvious choice. He positioned his cavalry on his left flank, planning to sweep around Caesar's right and attack from behind. It was textbook military strategy, the kind taught in every war college even today. But Caesar saw this coming from miles away. Here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating. Caesar pulled out his fourth line of reserves and positioned them at an angle behind his cavalry. Then came the moment that changed everything. As Pompey's horsemen charged forward, confident in their numerical superiority, Caesar gave one of the most memorable battle orders in military history. Strike at their faces. Aim for the pretty boys. Now, you might think this was just Caesar being crude, but there's brilliant psychology behind this command. Pompey's cavalry was largely made up of young Roman nobles, the sons of senators and wealthy families. These weren't hardened veterans with scars and missing teeth. These were Rome's golden boys, used to admiration and luxury, fighting more for glory than survival. Caesar understood that vanity was their weakness. When Caesar's veterans began thrusting their spears directly at the faces of these aristocratic cavalrymen, something unexpected happened. These young nobles, terrified of being disfigured, broke ranks and fled. Imagine the psychological impact. One moment you're charging toward victory, the next you're running for your life because someone's about to scar your perfect face. With Pompey's cavalry in full retreat, Caesar's hidden fourth line swept around and struck Pompey's main force from behind. The battle that was supposed to showcase Pompey's superiority turned into a complete rout. Within hours, the man who had conquered the East and stood as Rome's greatest general was watching his army disintegrate before his eyes. But here's what makes this moment even more dramatic. As Caesar's forces pressed their advantage, Pompey himself stood frozen on a small hill, watching 20 years of military reputation crumble in a single afternoon. Witnesses described him as looking like a man who had aged a decade in mere hours. When his officers finally convinced him to flee, Pompey reportedly said, "What, into the city too?" He couldn't believe that Caesar had actually won. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Caesar, showing the clemency that would become his trademark, pardoned captured senators and officers. But Pompey? He had already made his escape toward Egypt, probably thinking he could regroup with Ptolemy XIII and continue the fight. Little did Pompey know that his greatest betrayal was yet to come. When his ship arrived in Egypt, young Ptolemy XIII faced an impossible choice: harbor Rome's greatest fugitive and risk Caesar's wrath, or eliminate the problem entirely. In one of history's most shocking acts of political calculation, Ptolemy ordered Pompey's assassination right there on the beach. Picture the scene. Pompey Magnus, conqueror of pirates, subduer of the East, the man who had celebrated 3 triumphs in Rome, stepped onto Egyptian sand only to be struck down by men he had considered allies. His head was severed and presented to Caesar as a gift when the victor arrived days later. But here's the twist that shows Caesar's complex character. When presented with his rival's head, Caesar reportedly wept. Whether from genuine grief or political theater, we'll never know. But it demonstrated that even in victory, the cost of civil war weighed heavily on Rome's new master. The Battle of Pharsalus lasted only a few hours, but its consequences echoed through centuries. In those brief moments when cavalry fled from the threat of facial scars, when disciplined veterans outmaneuvered superior numbers, and when one man's tactical genius overcame another's resources, the Roman Republic drew its last breath. Caesar had won more than a battle. He had won the future itself, though he probably didn't realize that his own assassination was now just 6 years away, set in motion by the very victory he had just achieved. When Caesar returned to Rome after Pompey's death, he entered a city that was both celebrating and trembling. The streets were filled with crowds cheering their conquering hero. But behind the marble columns of the Senate House, whispers of fear and resentment grew louder each day. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon as a rebel, but now he stood as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The question was, what would he do with all that power? Caesar wasted no time in showing exactly what kind of ruler he intended to be. He declared himself dictator, but here's where the story gets fascinating. This wasn't your typical ancient tyrant grabbing power for personal gain. Caesar genuinely believed he could fix Rome's problems, and his reforms were absolutely revolutionary for their time. Picture this. Caesar immediately began expanding Roman citizenship to people across the empire who had never dreamed of such an honor. He reformed the calendar, giving us the basis for the system we still use today. He redistributed land to his veterans and the poor, built massive public works projects that employed thousands, and even reformed the debt laws that had been crushing ordinary Romans for generations. But here's the thing about revolutionary change. It always threatens someone's position. While Caesar was busy playing Robin Hood, redistributing wealth and power, the Roman elite were watching their privileged world crumble before their eyes. These weren't just political disagreements we're talking about. Caesar's reforms struck at the very heart of what it meant to be a Roman aristocrat. The Senate, once the most powerful deliberative body in the known world, had been reduced to little more than an advisory committee. Senators who had spent their entire lives climbing the political ladder, following the ancient customs and traditions, suddenly found themselves irrelevant. Caesar would walk into the Senate House and barely acknowledge their presence, sometimes not even bothering to stand when they approached him. One particularly telling incident occurred when a group of senators came to honor Caesar with new titles and privileges. Caesar remained seated while receiving them, a breach of protocol so severe that it was considered almost blasphemous. Whether this was intentional arrogance or simply Caesar being distracted by his endless reforms, we'll never know. But the message was clear. The old ways were dead. As Caesar's dictatorship stretched on, the conspiracies began forming in the shadows. The irony is delicious when you think about it. Here was a man who had shown unprecedented mercy to his enemies, pardoning senators who had fought against him, welcoming back exiles, and refusing to execute political opponents. Yet this same mercy would ultimately be his downfall. Among those pardoned enemies was Marcus Junius Brutus, a young senator whom Caesar had grown to love almost like a son. Brutus was descended from the very man who had helped found the Roman Republic 5 centuries earlier by overthrowing the last king. The weight of that legacy pressed heavily on his shoulders as he watched Caesar accumulate more and more power. Then there was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a more pragmatic conspirator who saw Caesar's rise as a direct threat to everything he held dear about Roman tradition. Cassius had the political cunning to organize what would become one of history's most famous assassination plots. But he needed Brutus's name and reputation to give the conspiracy legitimacy. The plotting took months. These weren't hot-headed rebels acting on impulse. They were calculating politicians who genuinely believed they were saving the Republic. They called themselves the Liberators, convinced that Caesar's death would magically restore the old constitutional order and bring back the golden age of senatorial rule. Here's what makes their plan both brilliant and tragically naive. They chose the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month, when the Senate would be meeting in the theater of Pompey. The symbolism was perfect from their perspective. They would kill the dictator in a building named after his greatest rival, on a day that Caesar's soothsayers had warned him to beware. Caesar almost didn't go that day. His wife Calpurnia had experienced terrible nightmares and begged him to stay home. The omens seemed universally bad. But Brutus himself came to Caesar's house that morning and convinced him that the Senate was waiting to offer him new honors. The personal trust between these two men makes what happened next even more heartbreaking. When Caesar entered the theater of Pompey that morning in 44 years before Christ, he was carrying legislation that would have fundamentally transformed Roman society. Plans for massive infrastructure projects, new colonies for veterans, reforms that would have benefited millions of ordinary people throughout the empire. All of these died with him on the Senate floor. The assassination itself was chaos. 23 senators took turns stabbing Caesar, making sure that no single person could be blamed. When Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers, he reportedly said those famous words, "Et tu, Brute," which means, "You too, Brutus." Then he pulled his toga over his head and allowed himself to be killed, falling at the base of Pompey's statue in what must have seemed like poetic justice to the conspirators. But here's where the liberators' plan completely fell apart. They had spent months planning Caesar's death, but apparently gave no thought to what would happen afterward. They walked out of that theater expecting to be hailed as heroes who had saved the Republic. Instead, they found a city in shock and terror. The Roman people, especially the poor and the veterans, loved Caesar. His death didn't bring liberation, it brought chaos. Within hours, mobs were roaming the streets, and the conspirators had to barricade themselves on the Capitoline Hill for safety. The Republic they thought they were saving was already dead. They had just killed the one man strong enough to hold everything together. Even worse, Caesar's assassination sparked exactly the kind of civil war the conspirators had hoped to prevent. His heir, young Octavian, who would later become Augustus, inherited not just Caesar's name, but also his army's loyalty and the people's love. The liberators found themselves fighting a war they couldn't win against an enemy they had inadvertently created. Within 2 years, most of the conspirators were dead, many by their own swords as they faced defeat in battle. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide rather than face capture. The Republic they had died for would never return. Instead, Augustus would become Rome's first emperor, establishing a dynasty that would rule for centuries. The tragic irony is that Caesar might have been willing to step down eventually. He was 56 years old, suffered from epilepsy, and had talked about returning to private life after completing his reforms. The conspirators' daggers ensured that this would never happen, transforming Caesar from a living dictator into a martyred god whose name would become synonymous with absolute power for millennia to come. In trying to save the Republic, the liberators had guaranteed its destruction. Sometimes the very act of trying to prevent a feared future is exactly what brings it about. You know, when we look back at this devastating conflict between Pompey and Caesar, it's easy to think this was just about two powerful men who couldn't share the spotlight. But the truth is far more chilling. This war was like a massive X-ray that revealed the cancer eating away at the Roman Republic from within. Think about it. The Republic had survived for almost 500 years. It had weathered barbarian invasions, slave revolts, and countless external threats. Yet it couldn't survive the ambitions of its own greatest citizens. Why? Because the system that had made Rome great had become its own worst enemy. The Roman constitution was never really written down. It relied on something called the mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. For centuries, Roman politicians followed these unwritten rules because everyone understood that breaking them meant destroying the very foundation of their society. But by Caesar and Pompey's time, that sacred trust had evaporated. Here's what's fascinating. Both men technically stayed within the law for most of their careers. Caesar didn't break any written rules when he formed the first triumvirate. Pompey didn't violate any statutes when he demanded extraordinary commands. They were gaming the system, exploiting loopholes that the founders never imagined anyone would dare to use. The Roman historian Tacitus later wrote something haunting about this period. The more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. Rome had become so focused on creating new rules to control ambitious politicians that they forgot the most important rule of all, that the system only works when people believe in it. And here's where it gets really eerie. Does any of this sound familiar? Political polarization so intense that compromise becomes impossible? Institutions losing their moral authority? Leaders who push the boundaries of what's acceptable until the boundaries simply disappear? The Romans had a term for this: dignitas, your standing, your reputation, your honor. For Caesar, crossing the Rubicon wasn't just about avoiding prosecution. It was about preserving his dignitas at all costs. For Pompey, opposing Caesar wasn't just about defending the Republic. It was about proving he was still Rome's greatest man. But here's the tragic irony. In fighting so hard to preserve their personal honor, both men destroyed the very thing that had given their lives meaning, the Roman Republic itself. Could it have been different? Some historians argue that if Cato the Younger hadn't been so inflexible, If the Senate had been willing to compromise, if Caesar had accepted a lesser triumph, maybe. But that's probably wishful thinking. The Republic's problems ran too deep. The wealth from conquering the Mediterranean had corrupted everything. The gap between rich and poor had become an unbridgeable chasm. The Roman people had grown accustomed to strong men solving their problems. Perhaps the most chilling lesson is this: republics don't usually die from external conquest. They die from internal corruption. They die when citizens stop believing that the system is worth preserving. They die when ambition becomes more important than service, when winning becomes more important than governing. The Roman civil war between Pompey and Caesar wasn't just the end of one government. It was a warning from history itself, a reminder that even the mightiest republics are only as strong as the character of the people who lead them. So, here we are, at the end of one of history's most tragic stories. When Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar first drew their swords against each other, they weren't just commanding armies. They were wielding the hammers that would shatter 5 centuries of Roman tradition. Think about what we've witnessed together. 2 men who should have been the Republic's greatest protectors became its destroyers. Pompey, who had conquered more territory than any Roman before him, died alone on a beach in Egypt, betrayed by a teenage pharaoh. Caesar, who had made Rome master of Gaul and shown mercy to his enemies, would fall to 23 stab wounds just 4 years later, his blood pooling at the feet of Pompey's statue. But you know what's really haunting? Neither man got what they truly wanted. Pompey never regained his position as Rome's undisputed champion. Caesar never got to enjoy his victories in peace. They both sacrificed everything: their friendship, their principles, their lives, for a prize that turned to ash in their hands. Their war teaches us something profound about power and human nature. Power doesn't just corrupt, it isolates. It makes enemies out of friends and turns allies into assassins. But wisdom builds bridges. Wisdom finds solutions where power sees only problems. Wisdom asks, how can we move forward together? While power demands, how can I win? The saddest part is that Rome had both. It had the power to conquer the world and the wisdom to govern it justly. But when those two forces turned against each other, when ambition overwhelmed duty, the greatest republic in history became just another cautionary tale. And that's the question that echoes through the centuries. What lessons will we learn from history? Will we remember that republics are fragile things, held together not by laws or armies, but by the character of their citizens? Will we choose compromise over conflict, service over self-interest? The Romans used to say, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. But in the end, it wasn't foreign enemies or natural disasters that brought down their republic. It was forgetting that those 2 words, Senate and people, were supposed to mean the same thing. History doesn't repeat itself, but as we've seen today, it certainly rhymes. And sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, we can hear those rhymes in our own time. If this incredible journey through ancient Rome has captivated you as much as it has me, I'd love for you to smash that like button. It really helps us bring these amazing stories to more history lovers like yourself. Share this video with anyone who's ever wondered how the mighty can fall. And don't forget to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles because trust me, we're just getting started. Until then, remember the lessons of Pompey and Caesar, and keep exploring the incredible tapestry of human history with us. The past is calling. Will you answer?